Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
I have this little flag here, and obviously it's a white flag, which is internationally known as the flag of surrender. So if you go into battle and you decide to give up, you wave the white flag, and it's a way to kind of tap out, to surrender, to say, I give up. And for this study, yes, it will represent surrender, but with a twist. We're actually going to have it represent God's will. Now, most of us, if we follow the Lord, we want God's will firmly planted in the middle of our lives, where we seek His voice and follow His will. But typically, we have two ways of pursuing God's will in our lives. First is by kind of forcing it, by trying to figure out what we think God's will is, and we kind of pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and we make it happen. The result is, instead of following God's will, we kind of just control it. We assume we know what God wants, and using our own talent and willpower, we're just going to make it happen. And often, we find ourselves actually, in the end, far from the heart of God and not even close to His will. We take control. We take the will of God into our own hands. It's us presuming we know the mind of God perfectly. It's us believing we know His timing perfectly. It's telling God, you know, God, I know what's best, which leads us to the other option in pursuing God's will. Instead of forcing it, instead of controlling it, assuming we know what God's will is and trying to make it happen, what we can simply do is surrender. Is just rest in it and take our hands off. And that's why we're using a white flag, because resting in God's will is saying, God, I give up control. I give up on what I think should happen. I'm done fighting with my own sheer willpower. Lord, I surrender to whatever you want. And instead of me making it happen, I'm just going to follow you regardless of the outcome, regardless of the circumstances. With this option, we surrender our will. We say, God, it's not up to me. It's up to you. We're saying, not what I think is best or what I think is what your will is. It's what you know is best. Well, in Genesis chapter 13, we continue to look at the life of Abram and this man he's growing in his relationship with God. A man who is learning about God's grace and His faithfulness. A man who is learning about God's ability to fulfill what He promises. And what we'll learn today has everything to do with this flag. And what we'll learn is this: control is the opposite of surrender. So let's begin our study with verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. So if you were with us in our last study, you know that God is getting Abram back on track. Abram had been living out of fear, not out of his calling, but out of anxiety and fear and concern over circumstances. Remember, Abram on this map, he was here in the land that God promised to make his descendants into a great nation, despite his wife not being able to have kids. The Lord had called him to this land. He promised to bless him here in this land. But there was a big problem in the midst of that calling. There was a famine. And instead of waiting on God, he stepped out on his own to make it happen. He created his own solution instead of asking God what to do. Well, his solution? Go to Egypt. Which, by the way, anytime Egypt is mentioned in Scripture, it always represents the world, the way the world thinks, looking to the world's solutions. So here's the question that we asked. Could God have taken care of Abram's family in the land of promise, even though circumstances said otherwise? Absolutely he could have. But instead of witnessing the provision and wonder of God in the midst of a famine, Abram settled for the solutions of the world and made it happen. The result? He forced his family into living a lie, almost lost his wife to another man, and ultimately put the future of his family, his wife, and the promise that God gave him through his descendants at risk, until he was rebuked by a pagan king. Great job, Abram. But God is gracious, and Abram, he's learning. And now God has him back on track, back at the center of his will in the land of promise. Verse 2, Abram had become very wealthy in livestock, in silver, and gold. Don't miss this. This is huge. What just happened to Abram? I mean, it describes him on this map leaving Egypt after becoming very wealthy in livestock, in silver, and gold. Don't miss this. Abram is experiencing an exodus from Egypt. This is just a foreshadowing of the future exodus that his descendants, the children of Israel, would experience. And you can see it on this chart, the parallels. Abram, he goes to Egypt because of sin, where the Israelites, they were sold into slavery because of the sin of their patriarchs, the 11 sons of Jacob, who would be renamed Israel, selling their 12th brother, Joseph, into slavery. Abram goes to Egypt because of famine, where for the Israelites, the 11 brothers go to Egypt because of famine. For Abram, Pharaoh and his whole house is plagued. For the Israelites, Pharaoh and all of Egypt were plagued 10 times. Abram prospers and carries away treasure and wealth from Egypt, which we're just reading about here in chapter 13. The same thing's going to happen for the Israelites, leaving Egypt hundreds of years later, carrying the treasures and wealth from Egypt. And finally, Abram travels through the desert wilderness to the promised land. And we'll see the same thing as the Israelites will travel through the desert wilderness to that very same promised land. Isn't it amazing how God can use our mistakes, our missteps, our lack of faith, and he can transform our mistakes into beauty and wonder. That's why Abram is learning to surrender control and give that control to the Lord. Verse 3, from the Negev, which we learned was the southern end of the promised land, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. So after a famine, after fear, after sin, after lies, after almost losing his wife, God leads Abram right back to where he wanted him. And it wasn't Abram that did it. It was God, right back where he's supposed to be, in the land of promise. And not just anywhere, but to Bethel, where he first called upon the name of the Lord. There's a lesson here. When you make a mistake, just recognize that you made it and get back to what you're supposed to be doing. That's giving up control, not forcing it. Doing the opposite, instead surrendering to the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at the time. So the land, it just can't support this number of people, the animals and the use upon the land. There were only so many resources and too many people and animals, not just Abram and Lot, his nephew's household, but the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living off the land as well. And you can just imagine the herdsmen who worked for Abram fighting over the available pasture land with the herdsmen who worked for Lot. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives." So it was bad enough to fight over the same resources with the Canaanites, which is why Abram recognized he and Lot, they're family. and there's no need for family to fight over the same land. Verse 9, is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Oh, this is such a precious verse because it shows Abram is growing, because it's such a statement of faith and trust in the Lord to provide wherever Abram is in the land of promise. Why? Because Abram gives Lot, his younger nephew, first choice. Now, in that culture, who should have had the first choice? By all cultural rights, should have been Abram. He was the elder, and in that culture, that meant everything. But he didn't demand his cultural right. Instead, he surrenders control. He surrenders his future to the promise of God. He doesn't control God's will or try to force it. He does this. Lays it down, knowing God's going to bless him regardless of what happens. Abram comes to this decision with the lesson he learned from the previous chapter, that it really doesn't matter which direction my nephew takes here, because God is going to take care of me wherever I am. This reminds me of this precious passage where the prophet Isaiah, and God's pleading with the people of Israel through Isaiah, this obstinate nation that has rejected God again and again, pleading with them through Isaiah, and directly addresses following the will of God. Look at this in Isaiah chapter 30. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it." Do you hear the freedom in this? We're so often consumed with choices about what God's will for my life is. And too often we're trying to figure that out and we try to force it into happening. But here through Isaiah, God says, whether you turn right or whether you turn left, whatever life choice you make, if it's this way or that way, I'll still be with you. Your ears will hear my voice behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it." The idea is that regardless of what decisions and choices that you make, lay down the flag. Just trust the Lord, and wherever you end up, obey his voice. That's Abram here. Remember, he just made a mistake and fled to Egypt. Why? Because of a lack of food. He's learning that wherever he is, if Lot chooses the left or if Lot chooses the right and Abram goes the opposite, it doesn't matter. God will take care of him. And Abram will live for him because he surrendered his will to God's will. Now, before we move on here, I want to make sure we all understand the geographical context of where Abram and Lot are right now in this passage. Abram and Lot are having this conversation near Bethel, looking southward. Their choice is the west side of the Jordan Valley and the east side of the Jordan Valley. When Abram says, "You go to the right, I'll go to the left." Well, this is the land that they're choosing from. Abram knows it doesn't matter because he's in the land of promise that God had called him to. So it doesn't matter what his nephew chooses, because God will take care of him either way. In other words, even if I don't have the best land in Canaan, God will still take care of me, which provides the context for verse 10. Lot looked around. Notice Lot's choosing with his senses, with his eyes. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. You catch that? Huge little hint here with tremendous ramifications for the geographical and archaeological history in the land, in the region around the Dead Sea. Because if you get the privilege of visiting that area today, this is what it looks like. It's a barren wasteland. Nothing grows. It's called the Dead Sea because it has an inlet, all this fresh water pouring into the sea from the Jordan River. But there's no outlet. It's just stagnant. It's this sulfurous dead wasteland with nothing growing in the water and nothing growing on the hills around it. However, before God nuked it, it was different. And by the way, archaeologists have discovered in this region, absolutely true. It was at one time a lush land, a vibrant area with water like the Nile Delta, with vegetation, crops, and civilizations right from the early to mid Bronze Age, which is exactly what the Bible describes here. And that's what Lot is looking at as he makes his decision according to his senses of where to go settle. Now we're going to read all about what happens to transform this region, the evidence of which can still be seen today. And we'll read about that when we get to chapter 19. But for right now, in chapter 13, this is the best, most fertile land available in the land of promise. Which makes me wonder if Abram was tempted to take the best looking land for himself. Remember, they're just coming back from a famine after facing a lack of food. And maybe that's why Abram, he laid down the flag and gave Lot first choice as a pure act of faith, giving up control and instead surrendering to the Lord. Verse 11, so Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain, and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked, and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Well, how does Lot choose? By sight, by his senses, by what gives him the best chance, the best opportunity to prosper, the best watered land. Lot's reason here is the exact opposite of Abram's, because Abram, he's already learned that lesson in going to Egypt in his own strength, trying to fix his own problem, learning that control, it's the opposite of surrender. Well, Lot makes this decision based upon what looks best and moves near Sodom. Here's this big, beautiful valley. It's perfect, isn't it? Lot makes no consideration as to how this move will affect his family or how the sexual perversion of Sodom will affect his kids. Oh my goodness, how we make the same mistake. I mean, look at this fertile valley. This is going to be great. This new job, this new town. Just because the door is opened doesn't mean God opened it. Or we want it so bad that we force that door open in our own power. That's why we must surrender. And we have to say, God, I'm resting in you. You do it. Your will, not mine. Because often what makes God's best for us has nothing to do with what can be seen. That's why control is the opposite of surrender. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are, to the north and the south, to the east and the west, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. There's such freedom in these verses. Freedom for Abram, because regardless of the challenge, famine, food, arguments, challenges, God is always faithful. Not just that, but Abram, your mistake, your mistrust, your lying, you're putting your wife and your family in danger, it didn't remove my promise or blessing. It's all yours because of who I am, not because of what you've done. Your descendants will be the dust of the earth. You won't even be able to count them. And it's not up to you, Abram. It's up to me. Go walk the land and just explore what I'm giving your family. Again, one more parallel between Abram and his descendants, the Israelites, where Abram walks throughout the land surveying what God would deliver. The Israelites, when they had their first chance, their first opportunity to enter the land of promise under Moses, they sent 12 spies, and those spies walked throughout the land just like Abram, surveying what God would deliver. Well, the 12 spies came back, and 2 of those spies, they knew God would do it. God would give them the land regardless of what they found on the trip, regardless of the circumstances or how big the armies were that they needed to defeat. But sadly, 10 of those spies came back and said, no way, can't do it. We can't defeat them because they're too great. Why? Because they thought it was up to them. And as a result, the Israelites couldn't enter the land and had to wander the wilderness for another 38 years. If it's up to us in life, I got news for you. I don't care how talented you are, how gifted you are, we can't do it. But as Abram learned, and his descendants would learn, it's not up to us. It's not up to our talent, our strength, our abilities to control and accomplish God's will. We simply need to surrender to it. And we'll finish with verse 18. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. Just a quick side note, because we know exactly where he camped here, where he lived, because you can still see the trees of the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where Abram lived. Now the trees, they're long since gone, but the holes where their trunks grew are still there. It's pretty remarkable, and it's the inspiration for the title graphics of this series with Abram praying between 2 huge trees. Those are the trees of Mamre. And as we close chapter 13, I want you to remember what we've already learned. That Abram never saw the promises of God come to fruition in his lifetime. In fact, he'll never own land. Actually, the only land Abram ever owned was a tomb that he purchased for his wife on somebody else's property. It would take hundreds of years until Abram's descendants took possession of the land under Joshua, after the promised land had been delivered and the inheritance divided among the Israelites. Joshua spoke to all of Israel, and just before he died, and this is what he said in Joshua chapter 23. Now I'm going the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Well, with that in mind, just ask yourself this. What's an area that you're trying to force instead of follow? Listen up. Not one of the promises God has given you will fail. What's an area that you've said, okay, Lord, I surrender, but you kind of pick the flag back up and attempt to control it? Not one of the promises of God that he's given you will fail. Finally, what would it look like to lay down the flag in your life, to say, God, I'm not going to force. I'm going to follow. I'm going to rest. I'm just going to trust in you, not me. Remember, not one of the promises God has given you will fail.